That classic book, First Things, dedicated to Daniel Nicholas Robinson, begins by recalling James Wilson writing in the first case that elicited a set of opinions from this first Supreme Court in 1793 with Chisholm versus Georgia. And he noted there that the judges were at the very beginning of the American law. There are no precedents to cite under the new Constitution. And so before he'd say anything about cases, he thought it fitting to write about, quote, the principles of general jurisprudence, but even antecedent to those principles of general jurisprudence, he thought it was necessary to acknowledge something about those laws of reason and the ground of our moral understanding. And so before he would invoke the authority of any case or any writer on matters legal, he would invoke the authority of that great Scotsman, Dr. Thomas Reid, in his excellent inquiry into the human mind on the principles of common sense, speaking of that skeptical and the liberal philosophy which, under bold but false pretensions to liberality, prevailed in Europe at the time he wrote. Okay. In other words, before the court would ascend to the task of judging, it would have to reject that skepticism in philosophy that denied the possibility of knowing moral truths as just as it denied the possibility of knowing anything else. Now, I came to know of the works of Thomas Reid as I was awakened to them by Daniel Robinson, my dear friend of 48 years, dating back to the time when we were both young colleagues at Amherst College. And Dan has devoted a lifetime of work in exploring in several domains that question of what we can truly know in the moral realm and everywhere else. He was one of the key founders of the neurosciences at Amherst. He taught the courses on physiological psychology, pharmacology, but he also took the line that those empirical findings in psychology that were worth knowing mainly as they bore on the dispute between Aristotle and Plato, Kant and Hume, about the nature of knowledge. I should have brought here that marvelous book they did it with Columbia, Systems of Psychology, in which Dan sort of traced to its root the premises that should be underlying in each of the branches of empirical research, to show that if you were clear on those original premises, you could be clear also on what research was irrelevant to the main question. It was an elegant book. But his books have shown that range in their sweep and their remarkable number. I brought with me the new book, latest book on Kant. He's written a book with Columbia on Aristotle's psychology, a book with Harvard on wild beasts and idle humors, a history of the insanity defense from the ancient times to the present, and of course his intellectual history of psychology, which has often been taught in courses on the history of philosophy. And that was surely the lead into that remarkable series that people here have sampled, and Tracy tells me he's listened to them, Dan's marvelous history of philosophy done through the reading company, the teaching company, just about every library now. The cause of Dan being stopped in trains in DC or restaurants in Oxford and asked for his autograph. He was one of the principal figures on the campus at Georgetown for about 30 years, but he's really found his truer home these days at Oxford over the last 20 years, lecturing in philosophy, with a remarkable series of lectures on Kant and on Thomas Reid, which you can get on iTunes. And in a break with convention at Oxford, we find Dan with each lecture ending with applause from the students, something rather novel at Oxford. Dan's lecture today marks another moment in the partnership or the collaboration between our new institute, named for James Wilson, and the Wheatley Institution at Brigham Young. The Wheatley Institution has been our partner now in the seminar that we put on in the summer for young lawyers, newly sprung from law school, on the way often to clerkships with judges or coming back from clerkships with judges, a couple on their way actually to the Supreme Court. And Dan does some sessions with us there as well. But we have with us today the director of the Wheatley Institution, our dear old friend Rich Williams over here, and his irreplaceable aide, Emily Reynolds, with him here. We named our new project in natural law after James Wilson, for no one apart from John Adams and Alexander Hamilton wrote so clearly and so compellingly in probing to the root of the constitutional order, pressing to the deepest axioms of our understanding. Neither Hamilton nor Adams really took matters to the root as systematically as James Wilson did in those elegant lectures he did on law at the University of Pennsylvania, things with passages thread through all of my writings. And he did this whether he was writing on natural rights of individuals, man as a member of society, or the nature and philosophy of evidence, which is really an exploration into the meaning of what was evident and knowable, fit to provide the ground of our judgments, whether in verdicts or in legislation. In virtually all those lectures, Wilson found himself drawing on Thomas Reid as his teacher and setting him against the skepticism of Hume and the skepticism he found lurking in John Locke, and we'll see more of that this afternoon. The skeptics, he said, may reach conclusions strikingly different, yet all agree on the existence of ideas. He says, wielded by one philosopher, he says the ideas attach themselves solely to matter and destroy mind. And with another, the ideas attach themselves to mind and destroy matter. The empiricists hold that we can draw our knowledge mainly through the senses, through the impressions that they made, say, in our hearing or our touch. And so by this construction, said Wilson, instead of knowing a person, we'd have an impression of the idea of a person. So Wilson says, hitherto we've been able to imagine with unphilosophic credulity that thought supposed a thinker, that treason implied a traitor. But all of this, we find out, could be a mistake, that there may be treason without a traitor, laws without a legislator, punishment without a sufferer. And if in these cases, he says, the ideas are the traitor, the legislator, the sufferer, then the author of this discovery should tell us whether ideas can converse together, whether they can possess rights, those ideas, whether they can bear obligations, whether they can make promises and fulfill them or break them. Well, we can't have a better beginning to the offerings of this year than a lecture that treats James Wilson at his proper depth. And we have here a master of philosophy to do it. So would you join me in welcoming an old friend to this podium, Dan Robinson.
What a wonderful introduction. I'm reminded of a line from Jack Benny, who received an award and very graciously told his audience, I don't deserve that. But then I have arthritis and I don't deserve that either. Hume, defended himself against the charge of skepticism. He says that the skeptical conclusions he reached in relation to, for example, causality, were reached in the privacy of his study, and that when he went out and had drinks and played cribbage with his chums, he thought the way other people do. And Thomas Reid, by the way, on that one, just to give you the flavor of Reid's writing, said, we see then that Mr. Hume has a theory very much like a hobby horse, which he can keep home with him and ride to his contentment. But just in case he should bring it into the marketplace, his friends would quickly impanel a jury and confiscate his estates and have the solicitude never to leave him alone. So that's the 18th century speaking. That's when our gang got their sea legs, raised by a first-rate literature which they commanded thoughts that they understood at a proper level. And unlike mere philosophers, understood that in attaching themselves to these teachings, they were that far from the hangman's rope. We are the only country founded on a date certain by persons whose names we know. Let's keep that in mind. Now, philosophers, political scientists, political philosophers have composed veritable libraries on the subject of rights, political rights, Hofeldian rights, libertarian rights, and so forth. John Locke has wonderful sections on the rights we have. Problem, of course, is that we're never told what a right is. We might be told how many we have or where it comes from, whether it's a kind of commodity that can be traded for yet other kinds of rights. So I would like to begin by raising what in my line of work is sometimes referred to as an ontological question. Is there anything in the real world to which rights intelligibly attach themselves? You know, like gravity and weight. There's a natural connection there, do you see? It's why you weigh less on the moon. It's why I've tried to book passage on the moon. So what could it be in a right that makes contact with something real, something really existing? Some years ago, my Oxford colleague and distinguished philosopher of science, Ram Hare, and I wrote a widely uncited article in Review of Metaphysics, two strikes right there, titled On the Primacy of Duties. And the argument we advance there, it's an argument. It doesn't call for discipleship. It calls for toleration. But the idea we advanced there was that the one thing about an entity that matches up with the notion of the entity being rights-bearing is that the entity has a certain class of vulnerabilities. And the one thing that matches up with an entity having something that makes real-world contact for this airy thing called a duty is a possession by that entity of what we call powers. Insofar as you have powers, you may have certain duties regarding the exercise of those powers, or the context in which that exercise becomes permissible. Now, once you accept at least that skeletal, it's a long article, by the way, and I'm not going to rehearse it. But once you do that, a couple of things fall into place that are not counterintuitive, but they might be counter to common understandings. First, rights and powers are not mutually entailing. An entity might be quite robust in vulnerabilities, witness an infant, but so destitute of power as to have no duties at all. So there would at least be some vulnerabilities that don't match up with some relevant power, and some vulnerabilities which are not offset by certain powers. So they're not conceptually or logically entailing. Now that's just a gloss to introduce tonight's subject by saying that James Wilson is going to engage the question of the sources of rights, and he's going to recognize in Locke a position that Locke takes that may actually turn out to be inimical to rights as these are to be understood within the framework of our Constitution. That's the lead into this. Well, of course, we now have so many more rights than anybody else ever had. These things are like rabbits. And you wake up every day and find out you've got 4 or 5 more of them. And I think this inflationary tendency might have begun thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt and other worthy persons finally finding their way into Article 2 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I shall read to you. Everyone, so you begin to see the size of the relevant domain, is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So it not only is something everybody has, but everybody has everything. I have the status of a lunatic. It's all right. I have this peculiar status, a very strong compulsion to defraud my friends and neighbors. Yes, well, that's a phenotype worth honoring. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, listen here now, jurisdictional or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitation of sovereignty. So whatever rights turn out to be, clearly they cross national boundaries, and they are utterly indifferent to gender, religion, political affiliation. Nazis may apply, etc. Well, one has to understand the context for a statement this gaudy. The war is over, genocidal acts that beggar the imagination have been perpetrated by an allegedly civilized people. Someone has to put an end to this. Look, be careful when you're putting an end to things, all right? Just be careful. Put an end to the damn thing, but make sure there's a world left when you're finished. Now, to be the sort of entity that carries this, range of protections, this defense against one's own vulnerabilities, with one, wherever one goes, under any set of political, social, religious circumstances, presupposes a creature of a certain kind, presupposes that those thus covered are essentially what they are. When Aristotle says that Coriscus is musical is an accident, that Coriscus is a man is essential, do you see? Some property that is so coextensive with the being himself or herself that absent the property, you wouldn't have the being, do you see? Essential and essentialism. It's a thorny topic in metaphysics. Kit Fine, who has done a very fine essay on this titled Essence and Modality, this is an older 1994 paper. I think philosophy was better in the 90s. It's getting terribly self-conscious. All my chums want to say things about the brain. I used to know almost everything about the brain. Within limits. And if it hasn't evolved much, and trust me, it hasn't, I've got a good memory. I still know a lot about it. Doesn't seem to solve much for me, you see. Let's do an fMRI to find out if you have rights. It doesn't work that way. Kit Fine says, the metaphysician may want to say that a person is essentially a person. or that having a body is not essential to a person, or that a person's essence is exhausted by his being a thing that thinks, a Cartesian person. On the one hand, essence has been conceived on the model of definition. On the other hand, the concept has been elucidated in modal terms. Now, this is the distinction that I believe Kit Fine is getting at. Aristotle tells us that man is a rational animal, so the essence is in the definition itself. We might say that although H2O doesn't define water, it is the necessary chemical substrate of anything that answers to the category water. So that's what we'd mean by a modal qualifier. It's necessarily the case that, etc. Well, what defines a rights bearer or stands as a necessary property in virtue of which something actually does bear rights? That is, if we use Kit Fine's distinction, is there something definitory that establishes rights bearers? Is there something modal, something that must necessarily be the case for Smith to have rights? Well, one foundation we can reach for to answer this question comes by way of natural law. One of the most trenchant statements of natural law, and by the way, on which coincidentally, and separated by a great stretch of time, both John Adams and James Wilson use for different purposes. Shall I tell you about Adams? You know, when Adams applied for admission to Harvard, the admissions interview was conducted in Latin. See, you want to pay $50,000 a year for that education, you're getting it cheap. I don't know what it's conducted in today. We sometimes have to tell students in Oxford tutorials, we might look over at them with solicitude and say, do I take it that English is your first language? Well, we're only kidding. We'll usually get a glass of something after that, maybe a cup. But when Adams gets out, he's a lawyer now, and lamenting the fact that he didn't get the same background in Latin and Greek that he wished he had got. Though he and Jefferson were very, very good at Latin, I think very good at Latin and Greek. Latin, certainly, and a bit of Hebrew. So Adams formed a club. It was a club that had 2 other members, and it didn't last long, so you know it was a good club. And the first work they picked to discuss was Cicero's defense of Milo, pro Milone. And this was the passage underscored by Adams. By the way, I've used Mr. Jefferson's collection at the Library of Congress. It's a fantastic library that he turned over. Some of those books never had their spines cracked. They're in great shape. Go to the Boston Public Library. Get hold of some of the books that were in Adams's library. He's got notes running up and down this dunderhead, and you know. So here's the passage from Pro Milone. Quote, "There exists, judges, this law which is not written but inborn. We have not learned it, received it, or read it, but from nature herself we have snatched, imbibed, and extorted it. A law to which we are not trained, but in which we are made, in which we are not instructed, but with which we are imbued." You see, this becomes the non-reductive starting point for the concept of law to have any meaning at all. This is what puts the ball in play. What coaches often say, you can't put in what isn't there to begin with. This is exactly the point that Cicero is attempting to make, that to be a creature fit for the rule of law, there must be something in place, something capable of resonating to the call of law, the summons of law. Aristotle, long before Cicero, asks, why do we attach ourselves to this? Why does anyone? It's not fear, do you say? We actively seek the rule of law. And he says we do that because law has the property of. Lunch is on me. What's the property? Philikon. Friendly. That is, the law is an instance of what a good friend is, who wants for the other what is best for the other for the sake of the other. If you read Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics on Friendship, and then turn to the Politics, where we learn that the attractiveness of law is that it functions as a friend would. Put those two together, you see. And Cicero's making a kindred point. Well, on this account, human beings are possessed of some essential quality of which they are somehow made, or with which they are imbued. Wilson cites this very passage as part of his analysis of natural rights. The question he raises is whether rights as such are derivative of civil rights or have a standing independent of them. The authorities behind the former proposition are many, and they include both Edmund Burke and William Blackstone. Burke, of course, is an icon within the annals of conservative thought. But be careful with these things, you see. Now, what is a conservative? Well, it's lower taxes. Oh, come on. Well, what is a conservative? It's a smaller government. Not small. It's this one. Wilson will tell you in Chisholm what it means to be a conservative today, I should think. When Wilson gets to parsing Georgia's claims, that Georgia cannot be sued in a federal court because it enjoys something called state sovereignty, Wilson says, I can't find that word in the Constitution. We don't have subjects, we have citizens. Now, where does the sovereignty come from? Suppose nobody actually lived in Georgia. Would it still have sovereignty? Because if that's the case, we can't have a nation. And as I shall say toward the end of my remarks, Wilson reaches the inevitable conclusion, based on the logic of his argument. Sovereignty is in the person. As he puts it, sovereignty is in the man. That all sovereignty grows out of that source. My shorthand answer when people ask me, particularly in England, well, what we know what a conservative is here. No, it's a liberal who's left-handed. So how should conservatism be understood? It should be understood as starting with the proposition that sovereignty is in the person. We made the government. It didn't make us. And what Wilson's going to find wanting in Locke are certain sections of Locke's, not the second treatise, Locke's essay concerning the human understanding, where as a prelude to Hume, Locke is this way and that way on the whole notion of human beings being an essential type. I shall get to that. Locke's famous political treatises even while granting to government the power to enforce the law, does declare, quote, "But there remains still inherent in people a supreme power to remove and alter the legislature," close quote. However, on this very point, Wilson notes Blackstone's observation that regarding Locke's somewhat eerie supreme power, quote, "We cannot adopt it nor argue from it under any dispensation of government at present actually existing. Locke's contention," Wilson concludes, is, quote, "merely theoretical." Now look, if you're a good Reed scholar and you've got a contemporary disciple who uses the phrase merely theoretical, you know how to read that. "Theories are the creatures of men," says Thomas Reed, "which nature seldom mimics." So, you've got a bald fact in front of you and a theory that denies it. Which one are you going to jettison, kids? Yeah, okay. There goes the theory. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on the Locke of the essay. May I reveal my philosophical prejudices, my membership in that most discordant of all glee clubs, the Oxford Faculty of Philosophy. Locke's essay concerning the human understanding is a work of first-rate philosophical thought, 17th century. Locke's second treatise is one of those political things. I don't know what the hell he's talking about anyway. Right. But the essay is, the two works were published the same year. The essay is to establish everything Locke wants the world to accept by way of the Newtonian conception of reality. Locke is an older friend, admirer, devotee of Isaac Newton's. Locke is a doctor. He's a good doctor. He's a man of science. He's had Boyle as a teacher. He saved Shaftesbury's life by correctly diagnosing the location of a tumor and actually presiding over the surgery that saved Shaftesbury's life. If you don't understand Locke as a scientist, you're missing 2/3 of the story. What is 17th century science at war with, and what is it joined to? It's joined to an essentially mechanistic conception of reality, something by way of Galileo and the Paduan laboratory, etc. Bang, bang, causal sequences, laws of gravity, etc. What lingering mythology has to be exploded for this correct view of things to prevail? That old Platonic, true form, eerie, woo, all of that. And central to all of that is the notion of essence. The real essence of things. Do you see? Man is corporeal in some trite accidental sense. He is essentially spiritual, or he's essentially something else. And so Locke takes it upon himself to examine the concept of essences. He says a distinction has to be made between what might be called the real essence of things and the nominal essence of things. The real essence of anything is its ultimate constitutive content. That being corpuscular, a la Newton, or as we would say today, subparticle. Hence what? Hence, you could never know the real essence of anything. Now, is this a glass? A paperweight? compass. And what I come to call something depends on context. It depends on culture. It depends on prevailing conditions, modes of use. So that there isn't some fixed nominal essence. There's a nominal essence that is tailor-made for particular purposes. And in fact, what fleshes out the nominal essence of anybody is just what happens to be rattling around between their ears. It's their particular history of experience that gives them the ideational stock out of which they construct nominal essences. Famously, he gives us the prince and the cobbler, because after all, what is more essential than that Smith is essentially Smith? Well, is he? Is he really? So the prince and the cobbler go to sleep under a tree. And in the middle of the night, the contents of the mind of the prince are transferred into the mind of the cobbler, and vice versa. Locke says, I grant you that on the next morning, they arise as the same man, but not the same person. Their personal identity just is the congeries of experiences to which they have access by some, we'd say, some memory mechanism. And that if that history were entirely different, their nominal essence would be entirely different. What makes Jack a prince and Jill a princess is not something at the level of real essence. It's something bound up with history, culture, habits, taste, mythology, superstition, etc. So that anything could be worked out to match up with anything. Now, some of Locke's contemporaries had a field day with this. They tested the implications of it. They already thought that the Royal Society was extending its reach into places it shouldn't go. And they started publishing some very fanciful and amusing things, referring to themselves as scriblarians. How many of you have heard of the scriblarians? I bet you can name two of them. Well, I bet you'll recognize two of them. Jonathan Swift, ring a bell? Alexander Pope, ring a bell? What do you think the Isle of Lilliput is all about? You know what's going on there, don't you? Well, you see, the scientists had figured out a way of getting sunlight from cucumbers. And if they enjoy a little more by way of royal patronage, they might be able to make enough of the stuff to sell it off quite cheaply. Sounds like fMRI research these days, you see. Give me a big enough machine and I'll tell you with your thinking. Or, absent the machine, I might ask you. Now, what is it that Wilson finds in Locke's attachment to the idea theory, so heartily attacked by Reid, and that Wilson doesn't mention Hume, but that later Hume will bring to perilous fruition? Look, it goes like this. You do not have direct access to objects in the external world. An object in the external world sends a beam of photons, some of which hit the cornea. Half of those are reflected back by the anterior surface. Of what gets through, those photons find themselves in a bath of aqueous humor, which is optically dispersive. They're spread around in there. But some of it that isn't reflected back by the anterior surface of the lens actually gets into the posterior chamber. Now it's really in the jello, and the vitreous humor is even more dispersive. So if you put about 500 quanta here, you'll get maybe 5 to 10 actually striking retinal receptors. How? It'll be a spread of smudge on the retina. So your picture of the external world is a representation. You don't even know how good or bad it is because you don't have some means external to experience to judge the veridicality of the perception itself. Do you follow? So that's the box you're in. You make the best of it. Now, I'll simply tempt you with this. One of the most original pieces of philosophical work I've ever confronted, for sheer originality, is a section of Reid's inquiry. By the way, the section that Hume said, if there was any part of your estimable work I didn't quite understand, it was that portion of your chapter on seeing, which you title The Geometry of Visibles. The Geometry of Visibles anticipates Riemannian geometry by 50 years. And it's dazzling. And it shows how, granting everything I just told you, you nonetheless get a depiction of the external world faithful to its external properties. Hence, Reid is called a direct realist. Now, he knows all about optical illusions. You forget everything you learned in Psych 902 or whatever it was. This doesn't play out at the level of, well, if I put on green. So Wilson is concerned now that the idea theory conduces both to a materialism in that the whole game is played at the level of the organs of sense, and a relativism in that what we come to know is relative to the apparatus that stands between us and the external world, and there is no other apparatus to provide a refereeing function. Well, Reid says, yes, there is. Do you know what the refereeing authority is? It's called lived life. It's called getting to the moon and coming back. Do you think this is just an accident? Reid says, I accept that the whole thing's delusional. What's the net effect? I step into a dirty kennel and I bang my head against a signpost, he says. And after 1,000 such experiences, I'm ready to come to the conclusion that maybe the world is as I see it. Now, when Wilson recurs both to Blackstone and to Locke, he concludes that if you accept the reasoning there, what you will discover is that not merely that man is made for the government, but is made by the government. He's a cultural artifact. Which is to say that find the authority that sets up the table, and you have found what it is that will shape the mind, shape the character. We're all passive on this account, and that this is simply inimical to the whole point of the constitutional jurisprudence of the United States. Wilson says, he quotes Blackstone, he says, the law, says Sir William Blackstone, ascribes to the king the attribute of sovereignty. He is sovereign and independent within his own dominions and owes no kind of objection to any other potentate upon earth. Hence it is that no suit or action can be brought against the king, even in civil matters, because no court can have jurisdiction over him. Wilson categorizes this view as nothing less than a, quote, plan of systematic despotism, unthinkingly embraced by those who have not examined the principle on which such a plan must be based. The foundational principle, says Wilson, is, quote, another principle, very different in its nature and operation. Laws derived from the pure source of equality and justice must be founded on the consent of those whose obedience they require. The sovereign, when traced to his source, must be found in the man. Now, there was something in Burke. Yes. Blackstone, in his commentaries, acknowledges that there are natural rights, but he declares that, quote, their establishment, he's talking about natural rights, this is Blackstone now, with respect to natural rights, their establishment, excellent as it is still human, close quote. The rights are man-made. At least for the English, they're derived from Magna Carta. Could I implore you to do something? Whenever you discuss the Constitution of the United States and its sources, will you please not cite Magna Carta? Please, not. This is fishing rights in the north of the Thames. There's a thing about religion. Don't cite it. This was something that a bunch of deep-pocketed barons held over the head of bad King John. Right? Bad King John, if you have no enthusiasm whatever for eugenics, bad King John gave us Henry II, who cut off Thomas à Becket's head, or had it cut off. This is a crown that thought its temporal authority extended to the gates of heaven. They got the direction wrong. No. Look, of course our guys read Magna. Class, youngsters, I'm in my octogenarian year. They read everything. They read everything. The farmers read. They were smart. I'll tell you one damn thing it means to be a conservative. Free trade, no tariffs. The first substantive law signed into law by George Washington was a tariff law. And then a slew of tariffs were put in place, thanks to Alexander Hamilton, which actually protected the productive capacities of the New World. It was absolutely essential. We could not compete by opening the gates. The field wasn't balanced. I don't have a horse in this race. My position on the US presidency is as follows. The first one was the best one, and it's been downhill ever since. It's called devolution. Well, on the view that these things are man-made, rights take on the character of civil privileges, proffered or denied by way of a legislating authority. The obvious implication to be drawn from such an understanding, which, by the way, later legal positivists would draw, is that rights are legal constructs grounded in certain social and historical facts. For Burke and for Blackstone, this does not amount to a denial of the naturalness of rights, only to their ultimate source within civil society, and that is the position for which Locke provides a philosophical foundation in the essay concerning the human understanding, rendering the essay incompatible with the second treatise, and all of those works incompatible with the founding assumptions behind the Constitution of the United States. I was told to go 10 to 7, but we began late, so I went till 5 to 7. Thanks very much for your attention.